History Lecture Series presentation of St. Bernard history from 1865 to 1919. I'm Curtis Manning, and I'm a history professor at Nunez. And I would like to express my gratitude, absolutely, for the Murrow Foundation helping us to present these great lectures. So the St. Bernard History Lecture Series is a chronological series of lectures of St. Bernard history, with the idea that eventually these will be each chapters in the book. So we're taking this one story, but it's part of a longer story. In the past, we have had several guest lecturers who know a lot more about St. Bernard history than I do for the earlier times. So my role in all this is to almost take the view of an outsider, of a collection of the overall story. Good historians of St. Bernard like Bill Hyland and Ron Chapman are insiders. It's almost a family history. And so there's that great depth. So I am trying to have the overview, so please, as this kind of the informal nature, and this will be a historical document, please correct any misstatements of fact or anything like that if you hear that. So we'll get all that underway. And so for this eventual story then, what I'll be doing is, for the overall story, take each of the sections to fit the story of who we are today and work backwards. So in my view, looking through that, I really see about 5 approaches from different times. The first one, the main one, is the geographical and historical development of St. Bernard in 3 main areas. And I'm not very imaginative, so I'm calling these geographical areas Upper St. Bernard, Middle St. Bernard, and Lower St. Bernard. So Upper St. Bernard will pretty much be from Araby all the way to Violet, kind of making the historical and geographical difference. Middle St. Bernard, which is the main story where we are in this era, that is the original Isleño settlements on Bayou Terre. And we'll see in a second. And then Lower St. Bernard are the far reaches, like Delacroix Islands, Wyclosky, Shell Bayou, all that kind of stuff, or Shell Beach, all that. So, and just made these at different times. These have all kind of developed, I think, a little bit differently. And of course, within those differences, we'll talk about the people and the culture and that development, as well as the government, as well as the economy, all these other things. 2 other interesting things that just kind of I came upon in the history of St. Bernard of commonalities. One is that there's a strong connection to St. Bernard, from St. Bernard to New Orleans, often with trade, often with different shipping ways, canals, other stuff, to shorten the connection. Early on, it was to try to get from the Mississippi River to the Gulf easier, maybe through canals to Lake Bourne, some other things that we'll talk about. But even from the very beginning, up through, of course, we know the Mr. Go, which is going to have a lot to do with Hurricane Katrina. A lot of the relationship with St. Bernard has been to New Orleans through these shipping routes, and we'll explore that in this era too. And then finally, the presence of hurricanes. From the very beginning through every single era, it is lots of hurricanes, devastating, the reaction to that. So we'll kind of trace these through all the different chapters through the eras. And today, of course, we'll trace them through 1865, which happens right after the Civil War, so the period of Reconstruction, up to about 1919. Very long period, and the reason is, as far as maybe national historical level things, not a heck of a lot happens. Whereas, let's say in the next chapter, there's probably one, which is the St. Bernard Riot in this time, but in the next chapter might be from about 1919 to 1928, and there were at least 3 or more just in that short time of national level historical things, which we'll get to that. All right. So first off, in these 3 areas of the development of St. Bernard and kind of why I've chosen, I'm very simplistic when it comes to the history, and a lot of the reason for the areas is simply geology. And so we'll see that this is part here would be called, this in pink is Upper St. Bernard. This is high ground along the Mississippi River, so those where plantations are going to be. We're going to see in Upper St. Bernard at this time and before, very few large plantations. All right? This period, this area right here is Bayou Terrebonne, which was one of the previous distributaries of the Mississippi River. So it has very high land on either side. So this is where that pink is, the high land, is Middle St. Bernard. And then the Lower St. Bernard doesn't even make it on the map because it was very small and there's not a lot of high land and kind of secondary to the development of the other parts. All right. So in our current time then, let's bring forward this idea of the three different areas to this period, 1865 to 1919. And the most important one is going to be, so the most important area is Middle St. Bernard at this time. All the action of all the history up to this point has been in Middle St. Bernard, the original Isleño settlement. So when Bill Highland gave the talk about it, none of the rest of the Lower St. Bernard is very, very little populated, and it's just in this area that it starts. Upper St. Bernard is just these few large, maybe 20 or a little bit less plantations. So not a lot of action there. All the government politics, most of the people are going to be in Middle St. Bernard. The Middle St. Bernard is Spanish speaking, of course, and we're going to talk about, like, as an outsider, I try to give the view of the people that is very different from what, at least I imagined, and it's very different from the rest of America. I would say that the people of Middle of St. Bernard would be Spanish. We'll call them Creole, and there's some complexity, but they would speak Spanish, they associate themselves with Spanish, they would not be American, that kind of thing, and that's going to continue for some time. In Upper St. Bernard, they are French. They're going to speak French, they're going to think of themselves as French and not American. And so even at this was in previous lectures, but when at the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, maybe 1 in 6 people speak English in what is going to be Louisiana. And of course, going back to the European times where we talked about this, a lot of times the French and the Spanish people are not going to like each other that much. So in Upper St. Bernard, we're going to find in the next era, Dr. L.A. Miro, as well as Leander Perez, who's from Plaquemines but associated with it. Their first language is French, even in into the 1900s. All right, P.G.T. Beauregard, who actually was from Middle St. Bernard, but he's more the French. He kind of moved there, whatever. Family did. He spoke French first. All right, so it's a very, very different time. So, and then of course, Lower St. Bernard is going to be Spanish. But tracing this back in history and why Louisiana is so different is it goes back to the parents. Louisiana, of course, will be mostly French and Spanish over the different times and kind of alternate between those until 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. And at that time, the French and the Spanish residents would identify as that, and they didn't like the Americans at all. The institutions of France and Spain are going to be are very different than the English rest of America. Even today, 49 other states trace their institutions, law, other stuff, back to the English colonists who settled it among 13 colonies, whereas Louisiana, it's French and Spanish. France and Spain had what I call the strong king system, which is very hierarchical. They had a very strong king and the people didn't matter much. And so if Louis XIV in France, that's who Louisiana is named for. So he was the Sun King, he's up here, everybody else is down here and don't matter. That's the strong king system. That's going to come to Spanish and French Louisiana, and thus the governors, the political leaders, are going to be what we would call authoritarian, dictatorial, whatever. They're going to be as strong, almost a military-like thing. The people do not have any say in the government, and they're kind of fine with it. The rest of America, there's much more participatory democracy, not in Louisiana. So we're going to see as we go forward in St. Bernard, which is a direct descendant of both French and Spanish Louisiana, there's going to be less participatory democracy and very, very strong political leaders that we'll talk about. Likewise, France and Spain both had a state religion, which was Roman Catholicism. England did, but didn't really enforce it so much in the other colonies. So fast forward, St. Bernard and the rest of Louisiana, at least South Louisiana, heavily Catholic, and very important with that. So we would have, the early St. Bernardians had a very strong military type leader, but also they were Catholic. We have in St. Bernard, Louisiana, parishes because it was set up in a religious type way. Right? Also, the France and Spain, strongly Catholic, set up the education, all kind of other stuff. All right, so all that worked out. Let's say, for example, in the earlier time in St. Bernard, the government was kind of the church. It was all the same place. The excavations on St. Bernard Catholic Church go back, and so there's a lot of issues because most of it was for the church part, and thus you can't disturb the graves and all that. However, the back part of it was for the administrative seat of the parish, the political head, which was on the church grounds, because it was all kind of together. And so as we go forward in the next several things too, we'll see that very strong leadership. All right, so, and when Louisiana became part of America and the Americans tried to impose participatory democracy, so they had to get out and vote, do stuff, jury duty, those kind of things, the French and Spanish Creoles, it was almost a civil war. They rebelled so much, they didn't want to go on jury duty. They didn't want to have to participate in the government, do all that stuff. All right, so like for instance, the Americans tried to put counties in, and then there was such a rebellion and went back to parishes. All right, so moving forward then. All right, so with Middle St. Bernard then, as far as the government in Middle St. Bernard, where all the action is, so basically with this lack of tradition of democracy, there's going to be a group of people that come in after Reconstruction called the Old Regulars Courthouse Ring or gang or something like that. So basically, there's going to be we're talking about a very small place, pretty much from about 1860 to about 1920, the areas we're talking about. There's a range of 4,000 to 5,000 people kind of going up and never getting above that in all those 60 years, right? And so in Middle St. Bernard, which we're going to see, so this part is Middle St. Bernard. At the time, St. Bernard Village, where the current courthouse is the geographical center of St. Bernard Parish of the people of the geography. So that's where the courthouse is going to be located. And a courthouse at this time is much more than just where you have trials. Pretty much all of anything government-wise is going to be centered in a courthouse, including, the tax collector, the sheriff, any kind of charitable distribution. Anything with government is going to be there, so you can tell where the seat of power is going to be. For about 30 years or so, up until the next era, which is going to be where the political center moves to the upper parish, and that's where we get Dr. L.A. Miro, who come in, we'll talk about that. And thus, towards the French side of things, and take power away from the Spanish Middle St. Bernard. But up until that time, the time we're talking about, these old regulars, or this kind of controlled government, has a great deal of stability. Right? So the key person will be Esteve E. Nunez, who's going to be sheriff from 1879 till his death in 1909. He is going to be the originator of the current St. Bernard Sheriff Department. And we're going to see from this time on, including in the next eras, it's really the power is in the role of sheriff and district attorney. Because of course as sheriff, you can control pretty much criminal related things, who's arrested, that kind of thing. And as district attorney, any prosecutions in court trials, all that is kind of under control. And so at this time, so Esteve E. Nunez was sheriff. Then a little bit later on, when he dies, he's going to be followed by Albert Estopanol, who will be sheriff for a while, but he's going to be the most esteemed one. He'll go on to be lieutenant governor of Louisiana. He's going to be a congressman, a whole bunch of other stuff. Let's see. All right, there's the courthouse, by the way. That's Albert Estopanol. And then Nemours Nunez, the son of Steve Nunez, will fill some of those offices too, especially district attorney. So there's kind of we're going to see this again and again, where it's not really a democratic structure, but there's usually, there's not much chaos. And then we're a new group, so the next group will be the new regulars, and they're able to gain that kind of control, and then it kind of moves on. And so this time there's good. So the location of the courthouse was 1848, where the current courthouse is now, because of the geographic center. It is going to be moved. Now it's a symbol of the power. It'll be moved to what we'll call Araby during Reconstruction. We're going to find out that the Spanish Middle St. Bernard is going to be mostly Democratic, and we're going to see that the Reconstruction era governments, especially in New Orleans and others, are going to be mostly Republican, and we'll talk about there's going to be a big fight between the two. So during Reconstruction, the courthouse is moved temporarily, but then it's going to eventually come back to its current location. So the courthouse is there. It's burned in 1884. It'll eventually be rebuilt just in time for 1915 to the actual building it is now. And then the Great Hurricane of 1915 is going to destroy parts of it. And then it'll eventually be occupied in 1960 and stay there until 1939. And then that kind of symbolized the shift over to the power, the population, all that, being in upper St. Bernard or Chalmette, where it is. All right? It's kind of, there's not a lot of action going on, just middle St. Bernard is just going along. There's political status quo, all that. What's going to happen is there have been lots of, before the Civil War, because sugar was so valuable, a lot of the small farms of the Isleños are going to be combined into big sugar plantations, even in middle St. Bernard, up and down Bayou Terrebonne. Civil War comes, decimates sugar production. So after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, a lot of the sugar plantations do not come back. They don't have the capital. They just lie idle. So a lot of the plantations are going to be broken up again into smaller farms. And that happened a lot along Bayou Terrebonne. So there'll be a lot more smaller farms, not these big plantations anymore. Obviously, without slavery, the labor costs are too high, so it just doesn't work. All right, so lots of smaller farms. That being said, I thought it was very interesting that Poydras Plantation, which is right where Bayou Terrebonne would have come into the Mississippi River and where a lot of the crevasses are and everything. But Poydras Plantation, as late as 1906, was a very large working sugar producer. And so a lot of outside capital had come in. It was like a lot more of a big business. So even in 1906, there were 2,000 acres of land under cultivation, 200 laborers. It took 180 mules. And that the refinery, which was there, had a grinding capacity of 600 tons per day. So all that had to be done there. That was very impressive to me. I don't know the technical part of it too much. We're going to find out that a little bit after that, the American Sugar Refinery is going to come along and I guess do a lot of refining after that. All right, so just a lot of normal life going on, but the one national level piece of history during this time that's going to happen is the St. Bernard riot. And so the St. Bernard riot will be a riot around the issues of Reconstruction. Taking a step back, during Reconstruction, of course, it's a civil war. The powers that be in Louisiana, the big plantation owners, others have sided with the Confederacy, and that's the Democratic Party at the time. So then Louisiana is occupied by the Northerners very early on, and the political party associated with the Northerners and the freedmen who had gotten the right to vote are going to be the Republicans. It's a very uncertain, chaotic time in Louisiana and Southern history. Much has been destroyed, all that. Very bad economic times. So during this, in October of 1868, so we've been in, the Civil War is going to end in 1865. The South is under Reconstruction, essentially dictated by the Northern, and the soldiers are there. And they're, the people who are the former elites in Louisiana are going to try to get around these mandated changes. They're going to want to go back to the old way of doing things when they were in power. And so they're going to use guerrilla-type tactics in order to overthrow their occupiers. Of course, we know now that the occupiers are really doing it for the moral reason of ending the Civil War, ending slavery, all that. But it was a very fraught time. 1865, Civil War end, moved right into Reconstruction. And so in October of 1868, it's going to be the lead up to the presidential election in 1868. I will say that it's difficult in doing the research. The St. Bernard riot is what is generally been known as to me, but I've also heard it called the St. Bernard race riots. And then there's a book published by Chris Deere just in the last few weeks. He was going to talk to us about this period of time, and he calls it the St. Bernard Parish Massacre. All right, so generally in history, with a lot of these things, what you call it has a lot to do with what your views are, and so it gets called different things at different times based on if people want to minimize it or not and all that. So, but I would say, yeah, so any of those would work, even though the St. Bernard riot is usually what happened. So 1868 election, it's going to be between Ulysses S. Grant, who's the Republican, who represents more imposed Reconstruction on the South, and is would be the favor of the kind of Republican government of New Orleans, who's in power, as well as the freedmen. The other candidate, the Democratic candidate, was Horatio Seymour, and if he got elected, he would end Reconstruction and thus remove the soldiers. I think both sides knew that as long as the Northern soldiers were in place, that the new 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed the right of citizenship and then the right to vote to the freedmen, would be enforced. But as soon as the soldiers left, then they would not be enforced any longer. And so we've talked about Battle of Liberty Place and others were these events that tried to get rid of the Republican way of government. Didn't work. So we're going to see that in history, looking back, it's in 1877 when Reconstruction ends, which means that the Northern soldiers were removed, which means that went from a time of relative freedom for the freedmen to time of segregation, disfranchisement. But we're not there yet. So 1868, that really is the issue, though, even then. So Horatio Seymour is for the Democratic candidate. If he gets in, the president, he's going to end Reconstruction. So that being said, the race relations between St. Bernard Parish, which at this time I'm talking about Middle St. Bernard. This is the Spanish Isleños kind of powers that be, along Bayou Terrible. Before that, it had been pretty good. There had not been, like I think they would consider themselves Spanish, and Upper St. Bernard would be French, and thus freedmen would be, or African Americans, whatever, is just another grouping. Before that, the Middle St. Bernard Isleños were very poor, and thus, of course, they were above slaves, but otherwise acted very closely. And so you have all kind of instances where money would be left in wills from Isleños to freedmen and freedmen at the time, or slaves, or that kind of stuff. So lots of interaction. It kind of changed a little bit in the lead up to the Civil War because of the so-called Cimarrones, or the runaway slaves, that really populated what we're calling Lower St. Bernard, and maybe did a lot of, caused problems with some of the Isleños, stole some of their property, some other stuff. All right, so there's a little bit of dissension leading up to the Civil War, but definitely after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the Isleños of Middle St. Bernard are going to come out fully on the side of the Democrats against the rights of the freedmen. The same thing is going to happen across Louisiana and across the South, where generally, in our current terms, what we would call the poor whites are going to not be happy about, especially the economic challenge of the freedmen, as well as some of the social rights that they lost and other stuff. So there's going to be this battle over Reconstruction greatly through these groups. All right, so the Reconstruction politics, so election of 1868, Horatio Seymour is going to be the Democratic candidate. It's a very participatory election at these times, so there are going to be a lot of Democratic clubs that get going. And one of those is going to be the Infantes de Seymour, like Horatio Seymour, and they're just a club to try to, what we would call get out and vote, but it's not, sometimes not so peaceful. And some other groups have these Democratic clubs, but there'd also be the Knights of the White Camellia and the KKK, and others who are not exactly Democratic, but wanted the same things, to limit the rights, to either promote their own rights, their own interests, and limit the rights of the newly freed slaves and freedmen, especially the ones who had to vote. And so, one of these clubs then is going to be in Middle St. Bernard. It's the Los Esponjas is the main one, but I always thought it was funny, the Bumblebee Club. That didn't sound very, I don't know, that sounded kind of silly to me, but anyway. But so some of these clubs are going to plan to march down the road by Bayou Terrebonne to go to the St. Bernard Catholic Church, which was kind of the seat of a lot of the power, to have their club blessed. Kind of just like a political march, for their side of things. As they're going, they don't quite make it, and in fact, they come across some freedmen, and they want the freedmen to chant "Hooray for Seymour," but the freedmen are not going to, or they would be voting Republican against Seymour, and so the freedmen wouldn't do it. So there's, in all of these things, it depends on what newspaper article you read, and there are a lot of historical uncertainty, a lot of different sides. However, what is known is that one of the freedmen is killed for not chanting about the "Hooray for Seymour," and that's going to pretty much set out mayhem, where virtually all of at least these roving, what we would call gangs or clubs or whatever, in Middle St. Bernard would be for Seymour, and thus interested in limiting the possibility of the freedmen to vote, because they would vote for their opponents, but also any Republican aligned individuals in Middle St. Bernard, they'd be against them too. And there were at least two major Republican aligned individuals who were both they were both planters, one a former general, but they had come from the north, and what they would call at the time carpetbaggers, where they had come from the north and were on the plantations in the middle of these places. Of course, carpetbaggers would be, even though it's a very well accepted term, that'd be a bad word for them or whatever. But so these planters then, one named Thomas Ong and another named Lee, had these plantations, and thus they became kind of a natural gathering point for the freedmen, both so the freedmen would try to protect them from these roving groups, but also these roving groups would target those places. All right, so anyway, so what's going to happen is, on one of the plantations, there will be the Ong then is going to send a member of the Metropolitan Police Force named Mike Curtis from the plantation to try to go get the sheriff. Keep in mind the geography. Middle St. Bernard is controlled by those Langos who would be for Seymour. The nearest help is going to be Jackson Barracks. So the people of New Orleans, the military control of New Orleans, would have safety, and that would extend to Jackson Barracks. But you have to go all the way at a time when there are no railroads or cars to Jackson Barracks to kind of get help. And essentially, that's eventually going to come. But meanwhile, so this plantation owner is going to send Mike Curtis of the Metropolitan Police Force to try to get to the sheriff to get help because of the threatening behavior of these groups. And So Curtis does not make it. He's confronted by some of these groups, and he's killed as he tries to flee. All right, so he's on the other side. So he's killed, which adds to the mayhem, and so the uncertainty. So when that happened, on Ong's plantation, there's even more worry. So a lot of the freedmen are going to come there to try to protect Ong, protect the plantation. And Ong's saying, no, it's just stirring things up more. You don't need to do that. But so this is into the night of the 25th. Everything is fine. And so this group of freedmen who are going to leave Ong's plantation to go back to another plantation where they were living. And on the way, there's a little bit of some uncertainty, but they're going to pass the home of Pablo San Feliu. That's pronounced correct. We need to go Highland to get all these Spanish things. So he's listed in the history as Spanish, and that he has an Isleño wife. All right. So he's a baker, but he had been known to sell alcohol. He's considered very racist, but he had been known to sell alcohol to freedmen in the past. So not exactly sure what happens, but a very large group of these freedmen go possibly to get alcohol or whatever. And so it ends up that Feliu is killed along with another freedman. He supposedly shoots a shotgun against this big group, and some stuff happens or whatever. And so he's killed along with another freedman, and both of their bodies are burned in this area. So meanwhile, lots of uncertainty. His family was allowed to escape to New Orleans. Freedmen obviously are trying not to be on the roads. White families are trying to get to New Orleans to get around it. Meanwhile, the election's coming. All right, so anyway, so on to the next day, Monday, October 26th. Lots more uncertainty, but doesn't end with any deaths, at least of white people in middle St. Bernard. And so they get through, but most of these roving bands on the Democratic side go to all the freedmen's houses and try to get their registration papers. So their freedmen are allowed to vote at this time, at least free black males above 21 that have registered. And so they're taking the registration papers so they won't be able to vote. And so it kind of ends, whatever happens, and then, so the sporadic violence continued throughout. Similar things happen in other parts of Louisiana as well, with a greater death toll. And so how it all ended then was that on election day, freedmen stayed away to not vote much, and it's going to turn out that Seymour will win the election in Louisiana, but lose to Ulysses S. Grant nationally, and thus Reconstruction continued on for 9 more years. So as far as the result of this riot, or whatever it's called, that probably it's tough to know for sure. Some things I've seen is that, of course, the 2 white people died, that we mentioned, Curtis and Feliu. And then the official things that I've seen is that maybe 9 freedmen died among the riots. But generally, it's kind of lawlessness that the freedmen would be accosted in public, out in the open by these groups and killed, and not much done about it, right? But in the most recent book, the body counts, and in all these instances throughout Louisiana and the South, the differential in power is such that the body count is always more on, usually there's on both sides, but a lot more on the freedman side. And so Chris Deere in his book just recently estimated maybe up to 130 or more African Americans were killed. Though there's no proof of that. So anywhere, so I'd say from 9 to 130 plus, whatever. It's hard to know because the records aren't kept. The powers that might keep the records are not, it's just kind of a different time. All right, so that was, I say it's not unusual. There are lots of these actions throughout Reconstruction across the South, even more so in Louisiana. There's one called the Colfax Massacre. However, it was kind of not, looking back, it was one of the not so good times in St. Bernard history. All right. so that, just a kind of a quick overview, and I recommend you read the Chris Deere's book. He was gonna come in one of these, because it wasn't too bad. All right, so I think we got that. All right, so now let's go to Upper St. Bernard. Not a lot, and we'll kind of go through this a little bit. Not a lot of action once again in Upper St. Bernard. Interestingly, after the Civil War, there was almost more of a concentration of larger landowners. All right, very bad economic times. There's not the capital to do the sugar plantations as we talked about. Some of them are going to be broken up into farms, but some of the plantations just lie fallow. They're just idle. Mentioned one, so or freedmen buy it and live there, but maybe not work it so much. So just very, very bad economic times in Upper St. Bernard as well. But the big, for the bulk of it, we're not to the industrial part, or a lot of small businesses and all that kind of thing. However, we have two big additions. The first one to Upper St. Bernard, we're going to get Araby, and we're also going to get Bibles. All right. So the first edition of Araby, which was in the 1870s, basically what happens is there's a large stockyard. The Louisiana Stock Dealers and Butchers Association in 1869 is going to have a big stockyard, abattoir, meat processing place. It's going to straddle the line. Big problem in New Orleans with the stench, with the dirty nature, with the bad health. And so it's outlawed in Orleans city limits, in Orleans Parish. And thus there's going to be, the legislature is going to move the boundary in 1875 of St. Bernard Parish on the other side to where it is today, right by Jackson Barracks, just to include, so that abattoir, that stockyard, whatever, would be fully outside of Orleans Parish. Right. So that's going to bring a lot of industry. So the western boundary still stays. We will see that this Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company then is going to be a monopoly created by pretty much the legislature to include all of these meat processing places around the state. And so I want to and this monopoly then is going to be challenged in one of the most famous Supreme Court cases called the Slaughterhouse cases, which the 14th Amendment, which I mentioned, was that gave citizenship rights to the freedmen. The first challenge to that are going to be the slaughterhouse cases about what we're talking about right now. And so really what that's going to do is going to limit the power of the 14th Amendment and in effect allow segregation as a police action, as a state matter. It didn't approve of segregation, it just said states can kind of decide these things. So, and also talked about monopolies. However, but I just want to read this as the background of that case, because I thought it's just amazing to me how different life was at the time, and especially with these slaughterhouses. So the background of the case was New Orleans in the mid-19th century, the time we're talking about now. This is before consolidating everything into Araby to get it away from New Orleans. So New Orleans at the time was plagued by intestines and portions of putrefied animal matter lodged around the drinking pipes, coming from local slaughterhouses whenever the tide from the Mississippi River was low.
It's a big cholera.
These were above the city. They put all the stuff into the river. It would come down and get into the drinking water and everything. A mile and a half upstream from the city, 1,000 butchers gutted over 300,000 animals per year and got into the drinking water, cholera. It was horrible. So, but of course, what's left unsaid is it was so bad for New Orleans they're going to locate all that in Araby. So that's what it was. But anyway, so it's going to be, so the Central City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company is going to be this monopoly that has all the meat packing thing in Araby. So it's a great economic boom. And so the town of Araby, at the time it was called Stock Landing, where the stock would land at the river and come over. And so the village kind of grew up around all this. My favorite St. Bernard history story of all that I tell all my classes about this is that there was a so-called blood canal. And so you imagine those hundreds of thousands blood from all those animals would, in an open canal, would drain. And actually in this research, I was wrong. So I always thought it drained in the Mississippi River, but it didn't. It drained back into the wetlands. So you can imagine this huge blood canal is what they call it. And so I had students who had relatives who talk about it, and I definitely would have done this when they're like 9-year-old little boys. The best thing to do to your friend was to push them in the blood canal.
Yeah.
You know, so you can imagine this is before regulation, both the drug regulation that we talked about, as well as any business regulation, especially meat packing, is not going to come until 1905. This is anything goes. So can you imagine the flies, the stench of this, not all the animal parts only, but all this just sitting open. All right, so it would not have been it was very good for the economic well-being of Araby, but it would not be good for the people who lived around it, except for the job that they had, which was good. All right, so everybody, along with that, in this time period, so that's pretty much 1870s, 1880s, those kind of thing. 1882 is when Araby first kind of gets its name, and that is there's a post office established there. There's a local contest to name the post office. It just so happened around that time, the Pasha Araby in Egypt was having a revolution, so the name was picked Araby for the post office. And then it took a few decades, but eventually Araby stuck, and Stock Landing went away by the early 1900s. What I think is interesting, we talked about, really we're not talking about Americans here, and the identification with Spanish and French lasted all this time. The Pasha Araby uprising was against the English. And so, thus the residents of Araby, who were French really, they considered themselves French, they had such a strong anti-English bias that they did this to say, you know what, to the English. But in overall history, I mean, it's America. America and England were good friends. You know, so it's just it shows that the French culture stayed intact even that long, that they would choose to do that. So it's amazing that it lasted that long. So along with the stockyards, those are to come first, but soon after the turn of the 1900s, lots of industrialization. There's going to be the Standard Oil storage tanks, which we know later on there's going to be a lot of oil refineries and everything, because there's the big Standard Oil refinery in Baton Rouge, the New Orleans Terminal Company, which is the Chalmette Slip, so a lot of things there. The Crescent City Stockyard is going to stay around too. The American Sugar Refinery is going to start up just after this. Very interesting so in 1906 they were constructing the American Sugar Refinery, which is now Domino Sugar, and they said it's going to be the largest in the country. It will employ 2,000 men when it got going, so it was a very big deal. The Bank of St. Bernard will come along this time in 1905, and the initial capitalization was $35,000. So it was a very different time. Of course, the Bank of St. Bernard will be very important through there. Gambling will also get its start. There's lots of gambling in New Orleans. 1906, same kind of thing. The New Orleans banned gambling within the city limits, so it went to Araby. And so really from 1907 to 1952, there's going to be a very strong gambling industry, but we'll deal with that more in the next lecture, because it's going to be important throughout there. All right, so the other big, so Araby's now adding, then we're going to get to Violet, which is at the other end. And Violet is also going to come around in about the 1870s. It really has mostly to do with what we're going to call the Violet Canals. From early on, I'm talking late 1700s, right after this lady was there, they started trying to build a canal to connect the river to the Gulf or through Lake Lorne, because even around this time and before, at first with the Mississippi River, the mouth of the river would fill up with sandbars, so some ships might have to take months to wait until they can come up the river or back. And later on, during the spring tide especially, the current of the Mississippi River, even when there weren't the sandbars, ships couldn't make it up very well, and it was just a lot more expensive because it's a long way from the river to New Orleans. So time and time and time again, there have been opportunities for St. Bernard to try to have some kind of economic reason for being to build this canal. All right, so, and one of these was the 1870s. There was Bayou Dupree, which we'll actually see. So this is the early 1900s map. It's called the Lake Bourne Canal. So it's going to go to Lake Bourne through what we call Bayou Dupree. So Martello's Castle that we talked about was kind of at the intersection of Lake Bourne and Bayou Dupree. All right, but it connected from English Turn, and so there was 1871. As soon as that started these efforts to build this canal, to deepen, to widen the already existing Bayou Dupree, but every one of these canals, and there have been many throughout the history, they were all just disasters. All lost money and never worked, or as soon as they got built, they were obsolete. And the Violent Canal is no different. And so 1871 tried, there was lots of fraud involved, it never worked. In 1886, the Violent Canal was going to be constructed, and it kind of did work, but as soon as it was built, it was too small for the modern ships, and so it was really abandoned before 1900. It was kind of changed. It was still working a little bit, but not very effective economically. And then especially by 1923, when the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal is completed, then there's almost no use for it. But since then, there were some industries and used for commercial shipping and everything. And so it will, but the name of what would be Bournemouth is Bournemouth. And for most of the time, and then once again, a post office will be built. The post office will be named Violet, after Violet Blair, who was the wife of Albert C. Janin. And so Albert C. Janin was the one back in the 1870s, a local St. Bernard resident, who tried to get this operation going. And it never worked, but he stayed around. He was a big landowner. So I guess, and the village kind of is a fishing village that came around behind that. And so for the post office itself, it was named after his wife. And then eventually it just became, it was just accepted as the name. Like, I don't know that for both Araby and Violets, it wasn't a set thing that it was named that. It just kind of became the acceptable name because of the post office, and then it kind of went on from there. All right. So another interesting thing about what we're going to call the Violet area and others, and this is a topic that if anybody knows where I can get some good resources on, let me know, because there's going to be a large influx of immigrants from Sicily in the late 1800s, especially in the Violet area, but also other places. So keeping in mind that you had mostly plantations, mostly sugar plantations everywhere. Civil War ended that, so the plantations either lay fallow or switched to other products to grow, or they're broken up into small farms. So a lot of the ones that are broken into small farms, the Sicilian immigrants who were farmers before they came are going to come and establish quite a good industry. I've heard that Creole tomatoes came from the Sicilian immigrants, kind of being truck farmers to New Orleans in a lot of this area, and of which we have, of course, very large Italian base today from a lot of these immigrants. All right. And so let's then move on to Lower St. Bernard, and this is the first time that really things got going. There's a little movement to the far reaches of the parish during the bad times after the War of 1812, when a lot of the plantations were broken up, everything. But then the real movement came during the very hard times of Reconstruction. So in the far reaches, especially Delaware Island and others, bountiful nature, however, kind of a primitive living, very far away from anything. The transportation is not going to come for a while. Middle St. Bernard doesn't have much transportation and access, and it's considered isolated. And so the far reaches, especially Delacroix Island, are very isolated. And that's where we're going to find where Spanish settlements, insular Spanish settlements that speak Spanish only, are going to really, and don't like outsiders at all, are going to really be intact to at least the 1920s, if not further than that. It's really going to be the modern conveniences like paved roads and boat motors and other stuff that's going to break up that very tight culture. All right, so for Delacroix Island, which of course is the main one, Delacroix Island was owned by an absentee owner, and there was never really kind of permission, but a lot of these people from Middle St. Bernard just moved down there because and rented for $1 a year or something like that, and started establishing these homesteads. But keep it in mind, it's going to be very small for a very long time. And so if we're talking 4,000 plus in the entire parish, down in the far reaches, it's hundreds and not more. So anyway, and so it's called La Isla, or the island. And so the famous thing about what life was like there, generally in all the histories, comes from an 1890 trip by a kind of what we would call a sociologist today, or historian, Alcee Fortier. And so he's going to go down there, and he was amazed by how primitive the life was, especially further on. And so there were a handful of people of wealth, and he's even going to mention the Nunez and the Stopinall, who we talked about earlier, but the vast majority were primitive maybe, but prosperous. Like they had plenty to live on and all they needed, but just not a lot of the things that were in New Orleans. But he talked about all spoke Spanish. He talked about them and described them as the children of nature. And so there'd be, as he's going down, so imagine Reggio, which was Minchek, that was the original settlement. Kind of, that's where you leave to go down to Delacroix. And so Fortune would talk about, but it was, wouldn't be a paved road or anything. And he talked about a dense oak forest covered most of the land, all the way from Reggio to Delacroix, on both sides of the bayou. And I hear stories even at this time, and even a little bit later, that when I visited Delacroix, it was only on one side, of course, it's almost all marsh, but there were bears and all kinds. I mean, it was hard oak forest, because that part was high, even though it's surrounded by lakes, for a very good amount of time. All right? The people on both sides of the bayou all the way down lived in palmetto huts, and the guy wondered how they could live in that. There's no chimney, so palmetto huts, just huts with palmettos as roofs and everything. There's no chimney, and the fire's made in the hut on a few bricks, the smoke escaping through the opening in the roof. There were small farmers, but it just talked about pretty much only onions, or maybe onions and potatoes, which would then, they'd have to cart to get those all the way to New Orleans to do it. And so no one, talking about this is almost 1900, no one could read or write in the population of about 300. Right? So it really is living off the land, that kind of thing. All right, so they seem, but even he mentioned they seem perfectly contented. They married within their own people. Virtually everybody else was an outsider, except for maybe who were Spanish who kind of jumped ship, that kind of thing. All right. Very quickly then, the other that I think is important was what is generally known throughout history as the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, which is going to hit worldwide, and it probably affected, it's the worst pandemic in history by far. 500 million people worldwide, which is about a third of the planet's population. It killed 20 to 50 million people worldwide. 25% of Americans got sick, and 675,000 Americans died of it. And it's kind of lost in history, which I'm surprised at, but anyway. But it was just a good story where it actually hit Delacroix, hit a lot of people, maybe 30 or more were killed, which would have been a large part of the population. And so there's just 3 individuals, Turiano Alfonso and his sons Willie and John then, would take the bodies that was kind of they were charged with or whatever. And this is like when you read about the old plague and all that. Nobody understood what was happening really, or how it was transmitted, at least in those areas. So they would, by pirogue or skiff or something, they take the dead bodies up to the St. Bernard Catholic Church, you know, again and again. And so there's a mass grave, because there's so many bodies. There's a mass grave there. And so one of the main points of this ground penetrating radar of St. Bernard Catholic Church, which was carried out in the last month or so, was to find that mass grave. And it was found, they think anyway. And so it was just a very primitive time. No, so in 23 days in Delacroix, 63 people died, which would be a huge percentage. But it was kind of funny that one of them told the story where there was a neighbor in Canary Islands when they were there that in Spain that said you have to drink whiskey to keep the flu away. And so they got bottles of whiskey and they all drank it, and the babies got it in the nursing and the breast milk, and none of them got the flu. And so it was all, so they were very happy about that. They never got the flu. So they're probably a little more lucky, but you know, that's how it works. But it's kind of when you read, it's a very, lots of good about the culture, and it's very self-sufficient and a lot of positives, but also a lot of negatives, the primitive nature of the insularity, all that kind of stuff. Shell Beach was actually in this very dark time throughout almost the entire South, economically of Reconstruction. Shell Beach was actually a success story, that because it was a great resort. It's one of the top resorts, like vacation resorts in the South, described as one of the most beautiful sunbathing resorts in the South in 1888. So the story of that was in 1836, this is a previous time, but the Mexican Gulf Railroad was built, which was built from New Orleans. But the plan was to go, if you look at in the boot of Louisiana, kind of the fingers on top, which goes almost into Lake Bourne, but on the outside of Lake Bourne. The plan was for the Mexican Gulf Railroad to be built all the way to the very tip of the upper part of the boot of Louisiana, so that there's deep water there. This age-old tribe to have goods then go by railroad to the deep water of the Gulf, and thus be transshipped, and that bypass all Mississippi to make a lot of money. However, the Mexican Gulf Railroad, as often happened, ran out of money, and so they only managed to build the railroad to Lake Bourne, and then they ran out, so that's why the railroad's there. So where it ended was what would be called Shell Beach, and so by 1856 there was a hotel with a 1,200-foot pier extending in, and it's gonna stay until World War II, a big resort and everything. So Shell Beach was pretty prosperous, but right after the turn of the century, right after 1900, really there had not been logging before, the great cypress forest. They'd been kind of logged out, but the transportation made it to where it couldn't work. So right after 1900, the cypress logging in those areas becomes a big industry. But also, both Shell Beach and Wyclosky become seafood capitals. And so the seafood from those places are going to be shipped to New Orleans, and so that it'll have the economic reason for being. And so in 1905 in Shell Beach, Celestino Campo, who's Blackie Campo, started the marine or whatever that's going to keep going with that, pretty famous around, and which was typical of, so the Isleños did the hunting and fishing and all that stuff, but for very short seasons. And so the enterprising among them would try other things to build onto that, of marinas and other stuff.